Welcome to Tanakh Talk. I am your host, William Hall, broadcasting live out of Kingsland, Texas, USA, with another episode of A Rabbi Cross-Examines the New Testament. Tonight, Acts chapter 12 with Rabbi Michael Skobac. How are you, Rabbi? Shalom, shalom.
Hey, how you doing there, William?
I'm doing fine. I tried juggling once. I actually did pretty good, believe it or not. And of course, juggling is obvious for why I brought that up. But there's only a certain number of things I can juggle. Let's just put it that way.
I hope you were juggling tennis balls and not flaming swords.
Yes, indeed. Fortunately, that was good for me. Because, see, actually, one thing I was supposed to be able to put up, but I didn't get to the trigger in time because I'm not that good at juggling, is this. Acts chapter 12. Yay. You'll see it later, Rabbi. You have no idea what I'm saying right now, but you'll see it when you get home. All right. Wow. Well, it's good to be back in studio with you. We definitely missed you last week. Not missed you, but missed you at 8:30, 9:30. I think there was probably a few less viewers just because they were used to our schedule, but that's okay. It's a great episode we had, and rolling on into chapter 12 tonight. And I know you've got a lot of juicy stuff ready for us.
Yeah, it's. I think we're beginning to get our way into the center soon of the Book of Acts, and I think maybe in a couple of months we'll be able to move on to Romans.
Hey, that sounds good. Sounds like a good plan. Romans is sure to turn up the fire a little bit, isn't it?
Oh yeah.
All right.
But I think we're going to have some very, very cool stuff coming up very soon in Acts.
Nice. Very good. All right, well, it's all yours, Rabbi. I'll follow along with the Bible as usual. If you need me to bring up anything in particular, in the Hebrew text or something like that, let me know. I'll put it right on up.
Okay,
all right.
We're going to fly now.
Yes, sir.
So, Acts chapter 12, it's it's a surprising beginning here. We're told that at that time, in the previous chapters, we saw how there was really for the first time, the messianic movement that sprung up around Jesus has now started to spread to Gentiles, to non-Jews. And we're told now that at about that time, Herod, who was the king, stretched out his hand to harass some from the church. Now, we've had a few Herods already when we studied the book of Matthew together. So the book of Matthew has Herod the Great, who was the one that allegedly sent his troops to kill all the Jewish baby boys under the age of 2 in Bethlehem and all the surrounding cities because he had heard the Jewish Messiah was just born, and he wanted to nip this potentially dangerous movement in the bud. So he, the book of Matthew claims that Herod the Great had this huge massacre of all these little baby Jewish boys. And then a little bit later on in Matthew, you have in Matthew chapter 14 not Herod the Great but Herod Antipas, who had John the Baptizer beheaded. So this chapter here in Acts chapter 12 is not speaking about Herod the Great, and it's not speaking about Herod Antipas. It's really the nephew of Herod Antipas, and this is Herod Agrippa the First. And so we're told that this Herod, the third that we've come into so far, he begins to now harass the church. And the question that's very immediately obvious is why? Why at this point does he begin to stretch out his hand to harass people from the church? Again, the church meaning at this point, essentially the group that was centered in Jerusalem, the students, the disciples, the apostles of Jesus, and the people that they had brought into the movement. He goes after them. And the question is why? Why would he begin to harass them? So almost all of the Christian commentaries that I consulted had basically the same exact approach. So I'll just quote a few of them. The New King James Study Bible says, "Why did he persecute the church? To win the favor of the Jewish leaders." He wanted to get on the good side of the Jewish leaders, and so he begins to persecute the church. The English Standard Version Study Bible, the Tyndale New Testament commentary, both say that it was a way of currying favor with the Jews, not just as Jewish leaders, that he wanted to get in good with the Jews in general. And he would do that by persecuting the Christians. The MacArthur Study Bible provides a little bit more detail. We know that he had a little bit of a shaky background himself. I think at one point this Herod Agrippus I was actually imprisoned by the Romans, and then he was freed, and then he was able to assume power. And so MacArthur Study Bible says that as a hedge against his shaky relationship with Rome, he figured he would curry favor with the Jews. So I guess maybe he was feeling that if he wouldn't have the Romans behind him, he'd have the Jews behind him. The Anselm Academic Study Bible says that the reason that Herod here was persecuting the church was because of his support of Pharisaic Judaism. And all these are basically what will come up in all the Christian commentaries. And, I wonder, as, someone who's not coming from a Christian perspective, could there be any other reason why Herod here would begin persecuting the church? Does it make any sense to say that he was doing it to get in with the Jews?
Right.
It's such a strange idea. What was it that provoked his grandfather to go kill the baby Jesus and all the little baby boys in Bethlehem? Was it to get in good with the Jews? I mean, it's very clear that Israel was occupied. Israel was not an independent, autonomous Jewish nation ruled by their own. Already long before the turn to the Common Era, Israel, Judea, the land of the Jews was occupied by the Roman Empire. And we know the Roman Empire, they weren't just occupying Israel, they had conquered, a huge part of the world. And they were very organized, they were very, very stern and strict in the way they maintained their empire, because they wanted a stable empire. They didn't want trouble, they didn't want insurrection, they didn't want revolt, they didn't want people challenging their authority. And so that we know for sure about the Romans. We know that the Romans wanted to assert their authority, and they didn't want trouble. They didn't want anyone challenging their rule. As long as you behaved and you paid your taxes, things are okay. The Romans really didn't care, what you believed. They didn't care what your religion was. They were basically interested in peace. They were interested in stability. And so Herod the Great, even though it seemed a little bit, super cautious to stamp out a messianic movement at the birth of this would-be Messiah, that's really taking things quite far.
Right.
But we know that, any time there'd be any rumor that there was, a competing rule, meaning that the Jewish Messiah meant that there'd be a Jewish king who would not accept his authority and would challenge his authority. So Herod the Great basically says, look, I don't want this kid growing up and being an adult that's going to make trouble for me. I'm just going to nip it in the bud and kill him as an infant. And we know that the Romans in general, they treated any suspicion of political insurrection, revolt, rebellion, anyone that challenged them was just immediately dispatched. They were killed, and they were killed in the most brutal way. They usually would crucify their political opponents. So, is there any reason why uh, Herod here in 12th chapter of Acts would find there's a reason now to begin persecuting this church. Well, just in the previous two chapters I mentioned that this small group, basically, of Jews that believed that this Jesus was the Messiah and would come back soon to rule, is now beginning to spread. It's now going beyond, a group of Jews in Israel. It's now spreading to Gentiles within the Roman Empire. And certainly that would be of concern to any Roman ruler, to any non-Jewish ruler, that here you have a potentially dangerous insurrectionist movement, a messianic movement, a movement that was centered around the belief that someone was the Messiah who would come back and who would liberate them. And so it would seem to me that someone like Herod and all of the Roman rulers, they really were never the kind of people who were so interested in getting the Jews to love them. That wasn't their main, agenda. They were not trying to get their subjects to love them. They actually were very, very determined to have everyone fear them. They ruled with an iron fist. So this idea here that all of a sudden Herod begins to persecute the church in order to make the other Jewish people happy and to curry favor with the Jews is, to me, a little bit strange, actually very strange. And I think there's just a much simpler and much more likely reason for why the government would begin to harass the leaders of this messianic movement. And verse 2 goes on to say that he kills James, the brother of John. This is James and John, sons of Zebedee, who were some of the first followers, the first apostles of Jesus. And we're told in verse 2 here that he kills John with the sword. Basically, he beheads James, the brother of John. That's how this chapter begins. And then, almost as an afterthought, we're told in verse 3 that because he now sees that it pleased the Jews, this pleases the Jews that he's killing the some of the leaders. He then proceeds to further seize Peter as well. And apparently he wants to do the same thing to Peter. Apparently his plan is to execute Peter as well. But it's interesting, it doesn't tell us that that was the motivation for persecuting the church in the first place, meaning that the chapter begins by saying, without giving a reason, that he now begins to persecute the church. He goes and kills James, the brother of John. And then in verse 3, he happens to see that this was pleasing to the Jews. So it doesn't say that in the beginning, that because he was trying to please the Jews, he started to persecute the church and he went and killed James. It's presented here as an afterthought. I would personally question whether this would please the Jews.
Right.
Again, we've seen before that Luke has a tendency to exaggerate and generalize, and to say the Jews. What does he mean, the Jews? Does that mean every single Jewish person was jumping up and down and thrilled that he chopped off the head of James? And the question would be why? Why would all the Jews be so happy that he had killed one of the leaders of this movement? So I think we're going to see in a minute that there's a very different way of reading this. In verse, here already in verse 3, after his desire to seize Peter, we're told that it was during the days of unleavened bread, meaning this was during the Passover feast. So in verse 4, when he had arrested him, so when Herod arrested Peter, we're told he put him in prison and delivered him to 4 squads of soldiers to keep him, to watch him carefully, intending to bring him before the people after Passover. So the big question I think that comes up here is this. If it was Herod's intention was to kill Peter just as he had killed James, then why didn't he do so? Meaning, why doesn't he simply do exactly that immediately? Why does he put him in jail and wait until after Passover? what is that all about? So the New King James Study Bible says that the reason that he put him in jail and didn't execute him immediately, the New King James Study Bible says because Jewish law did not allow trials on the holiday.
Interesting.
Well, I said to myself, really? I mean, it didn't say here that he put James on trial. It says here he just killed James. It was just,
Right.
he just kills him without putting him on trial. And the New King James Study Bible seems to imply that for Peter, he's not just going to kill Peter, he is going to put Peter on trial. And it would seem that he was going to have Peter apparently tried by the Jewish authorities because there was no law, in Israel for the Romans not to have their own trials. The Romans could do whatever they want. So if Herod wanted to put Peter on trial in front of his own court, what does it have to do with Passover? He doesn't observe Passover.
Right.
So for some reason, what happens now in the book of Acts is that it's trying to create the impression that the killing of these church leaders was somehow part of the agenda of the Jewish community. Now, to say that there couldn't be a trial because it was the holiday of Passover, that didn't seem to get in the way of the trial of Jesus back in the Synoptic Gospels. We know that in the Synoptic Gospels, Jesus sat at the Last Supper with his disciples, which they understand to be a Passover Seder. And so when Jesus is taken that night and brought the next day to be on trial, that trial takes place on Passover. So in the Gospels, they don't seem to have any difficulties having Jesus tried in front of Jewish courts during the holiday of Passover. Although when we studied those chapters, when we were studying Matthew, we saw that that's one of the reasons why the whole story doesn't really have much credibility, because of course the Sanhedrin and any Jewish court would not try people during the holiday. So here, all of a sudden, the writers of the New Testament wake up and they realize, wait a second, you can't have a trial, at least in front of a Jewish court, during the holiday. So the New King James Study Bible says that's why Herod places Peter in prison, and he has to wait until after the holiday. The ESV Study Bible, English Standard Version Study Bible, in their notes say, why did he put him in prison and wait until after Passover? So they say in this commentary, because an execution would desecrate the holiness of the festival. Because Herod was such a sensitive person and didn't want to offend, God forbid, the Jewish people and upset their holiday, so he would kill him right away. He would immediately kill him like he killed James, but he didn't want to get people upset about having a killing during the holiday, so he puts off the execution until after the holiday. Again, these two approaches make it seem as if that the Roman rulers were very sensitive to the Jewish people. They didn't want to offend the Jewish people. The New King James Version Study Bible gives you the impression that it's actually going to even be a Jewish trial for some reason. I find this approach to be very, very just unacceptable. But when you go to David Stern's New Testament commentary, David Stern is a Messianic Jewish teacher living in Israel. So in his commentary, he says something very, very interesting. And when you think about it, it totally refutes the commentaries I quoted above about why Herod now begins persecuting the church. David Stern says, why did Herod now place Peter in prison rather than killing him immediately? So he writes, Herod did not want to arouse public opinion against himself by trying a leader of a significant Jewish minority community during the holiday season, during the holy season. So what he's saying here, when you think about it, is that to persecute the church at this point would not have made the Jewish people happy. David Stern is saying that to persecute the church and to execute one of the leaders would be to attack a minority community in the Jewish community. Again, the followers of Jesus were part of the Jewish community. They were, they were not a separate religion at this point. They might have been seen as a little bit unusual. They believed in this dead man as the Messiah. But at this point, the Jewish community has this strange group living amongst them. And so David Stern is saying that to just execute these people would have inflamed the Jewish people, especially during Passover time. Now, again, if you go back to all the commentaries that we saw previously, they're saying that the reason that Herod began persecuting the church and killing James was to make the Jewish people happy. That would make them thrilled. So there seems to be a contradiction here, meaning that if the killing of church leaders and the persecution of the church is supposed to make the Jewish people happy, and it's going to curry favor with them, so there'd be no need to delay the execution of Peter until after Passover. It would be something that would thrill them. It wouldn't bother them. So David Stern hints at the fact that this is not true. He's saying that, this is not something that the Jewish people would be thrilled about. And as we'll see in a few minutes, it's important to understand why this idea that persecuting the church would have been something that made all the Jewish people happy. So let's pick up now with verse 11. We know that in the previous verses, Peter is freed from prison. He was in prison, and an angel comes and takes him out of prison, we're told, and Peter miraculously escapes. And in verse 11, we're told Peter had come to himself because he couldn't even believe that he was freed. And he says, "Now I know for certain that the Lord has sent his angel and has delivered me from the hand of Herod and from all the expectations of the Jewish people." Now here, it's not just these Christian commentaries to Acts that are trying to implicate all the Jewish people. Here you have already in verse 3 and here in verse 11, the author of Acts, which is Luke, is basically saying that it wasn't just Herod that had it in for the church, and it wasn't just Herod that had it in for Peter and James and the leaders of the church. This was all of the Jewish people. All the Jewish people basically were sort of chomping at the bit to wipe out this movement, to kill this movement. So I believe what you have here taking place in Acts is the exact same impression that was created by the Gospels, meaning that the Gospels were written with a certain agenda. Let me try to review this very briefly. And let me begin by telling what I believe is the truth. What is the actual reality about what happened during the time of Jesus? This will be a little bit of a review, but I think it's important to set the stage here for the book of Acts. So, the only people, I believe, who would have opposed Jesus and his movement when Jesus was alive, and his movement, would have been the Sadducees and the high priests, the priesthood. And they would have opposed Jesus and his movement for political reasons, meaning that we know that the Sadducees were basically in bed with the Romans, the priesthood as well. They were a corrupt priesthood. The priesthood was actually appointed by the Romans. And so this segment, it's a segment of the Jewish people. We have to remember that the Sadducees and the priesthood were not on the same playing field as the masses of people and the Pharisees. They were very bitter opponents. They weren't, of one mind. So if you go back to the days of Jesus, the only group among all the Jewish people that would have opposed him, Jesus, and his movement would have been the Sadducees and the priesthood for basically political reasons, for the very same reasons that the Romans would have been very concerned about Jesus as someone claiming to be the Messiah and the King of the Jews, because again, the Romans feared insurrection, the Romans feared rebellion, the Romans would kill anyone claiming to be the King of the Jews. So that was the reality during the time of Jesus, and the religious establishment, which were the Pharisees, which was, according to Josephus, was the major movement among the Jewish people, the popular movement among the people themselves, would have been okay with Jesus. They wouldn't have had any problem with Jesus. For them to have someone claiming to be the Messiah, they would say that would be great. We'd be thrilled if he was the Messiah. So that was the reality at the time of Jesus. But what did the Gospels try to paint? How did the Gospels try to paint what was going on at the time of Jesus? So the Gospels try to give the impression that all Jews, all of the Jews, Sadducees, Pharisees, scribes, everyone, were opposed to Jesus. Why? For religious reasons. The Gospels try to give the impression that they would want to destroy Jesus, kill him, and persecute his movement because they were opposing them for religious reasons. And the Gospels give the impression that the Romans had no problem with Jesus at all. When Jesus is put on trial before Pontius Pilate finds him innocent. I see no problem with him, Pontius Pilate says. And the Gospels give the impression that it was the religious establishment that had to pressure Pontius Pilate into killing Jesus. So what you have really when you go through the Gospels is a rewriting of history in a way that totally distorts what was really going on back then. And so the same thing, I believe, is happening here in the book of Acts. Here, what we're seeing in Acts is that we're told all the Jews were in favor of persecuting the church. And Herod really had no interest in persecuting the Jesus movement. The only reason he wanted to do it was to please the Jews, meaning that that's exactly what it's saying here, is that he had no real good reason for going after the church. The only thing that motivated him was that it would make the Jews feel good and he would gain popularity among the Jews. That's what it claims here in Acts. The truth, again, is that the religious establishment had no major issues with Jesus and his movement. And I'll just give a few proofs. We saw, for example, in Acts chapter 5, when Peter and the other apostles are brought up before the Sanhedrin on trial, the leader of the Jewish establishment, Gamliel, the leader, says there's nothing wrong with these people, leave them alone. He doesn't advocate that they be killed and persecuted.
Right.
He sees no problem with them. And then we'll find in a few chapters from now, when we get to Acts chapter 17 and Acts chapter 19, what is Paul doing? Paul is going into the synagogues and preaching Jesus. And we're told that he goes there for months on end preaching. Now, if the Jewish people as a whole were so allergic to anything about Jesus, they would have stopped Paul immediately. But somehow Paul is able to keep on going back day after day for months, telling them that they should believe in Jesus.
You know, a question that I've got with that whole thing is, I'm trying to picture that happening today. Some guy comes up, had a vision, goes to Israel, and he hits all the Orthodox synagogues. I mean, I just can't see that even happening. It just doesn't make sense that they would, because they know the scriptures well enough to know that the first time he tries to quote the prophets, they're going to immediately shut him down. So how is it that he's able to pull this off and stay in there?
That's exactly my point.
Beautiful.
Right? My point is that for him or anyone to say, look, we are part of a movement who believes that this fellow named Jesus is the Messiah. The only thing they would say to him would be, yeah, but Jesus is dead. He was crucified. And Paul might say, well, but he's going to come back. He's going to return. There's going to be a return of the dead, a resurrection of the dead. and he will come back and he'll restore the kingdom to Israel, and he's going to do all the things that we expect the Messiah to do. So they might look at him like he's a bit strange, because again, in Jewish thinking, in Jewish expectations, there's no expectation that the Messiah is going to come and then die and have to come back. But again, the idea that the dead will return is a part of Judaism. It's a part of the Bible. So it's not heretical. It's not antithetical to the Bible to speak about someone coming back from the dead.
Oh, I just thought of something too.
Yes.
He didn't preach the same gospel that the Gospels preach. Because Paul didn't know about a virgin birth, because that's something they would have immediately kicked him out for, because they would have known better. And there's so many things that the Gospels talk about that Paul never even touched base on. So maybe that's what made it more believable from him than it would have been from, say, the Gospels. I don't know.
Also, you have to remember that the Gospels are written after Paul.
Right.
And it's not 100% clear that what the later writers of the Gospel are writing is exactly what the very, very early followers of Jesus believed. Meaning that what you're finding in the Gospels are accounts that are written 40 to 70 years later, and it's basically a rewrite of what was going on during the time of Jesus. And it gives the impression, for example, when, let's say, Matthew and Luke write about the virgin birth, that was something that the early believers of Jesus believed. That's what you get the impression.
Right.
You would think that anyone at the time of Jesus would have believed in the virgin birth, but that's not so. I mean, we know from the 2nd century that the Ebionites were a Jewish sect that believed in Jesus. They didn't believe in the virgin birth. So what you find is that it's probably, this idea comes up later in the history of the Jesus movement. Could be as late as the 80s, 90s, or 100s already. And then it's being put back into the early biographies about Jesus. But it seems that, Paul, and it's not really clear. I mean, this is we're going to have to get into a little bit later on. We know that Paul's preaching itself deviated from what the apostles were preaching. And, Paul would have had less of a chance of having a receptive audience among Jews than the apostles would have. But whatever Paul was preaching at that stage in the 17th chapter and 19th chapter of Acts didn't get him into immediate trouble with the synagogues. So the point I'm trying to make is that we don't have any evidence, and I would say the evidence is to the contrary, that the religious establishment had major issues on a religious level with the Jesus movement. They would have thought the Jesus movement was strange. They believe in this dead person as the Messiah. But the fact that Gamliel says there's no problem with them, the fact that Paul's able to preach for months without anyone giving him a hard time.
It doesn't make any sense at all.
Yeah, and I think the truth is that, again, the people that might have had an issue with the apostles and with the Jesus movement would have been the Sadducees, the priesthood, and especially the Herod and the Roman government. And they would have strongly opposed this Jesus group for political reasons. And again, I think this would have been inflamed once this emerging messianic movement is now spreading its wings to bring in non-Jews. Because what the leaders are seeing is that this is not just a small group of crackpots. They're seeing that this group is they're able to now persuade others to join them. So any ruler, a political ruler, that's concerned about the stability of their kingdom is going to get nervous about a growing messianic insurrectionist movement. So again, I think that what you're reading here in Acts is a retelling of the story with an agenda. And the agenda is very clearly to give the impression that the only problem back then was between the religious leadership and the Jewish people as a whole, and the Jesus movement. And really, the Romans themselves, they had nothing really against uh, Jesus. The only thing is that they wanted to get on the good side of the Jewish community, and that's why they persecuted Jesus. It's to me, a total distortion, really, of probably what was going on. Um, so, beginning now in verse 16. So Peter ends up coming to someone's home, I guess after he flees jail. He gets out of jail. We're told he goes to um, the house of Mary, who's the mother of John, and he begins knocking. And they're astonished to see him. They obviously thought he was in prison. And then in verse 17, by motioning to them with his hand to keep silent, he declared to them how the Lord had brought him out of the prison. And he said, "Go tell these things to James and to the brethren." Now, this is obviously not the James that was killed early in this chapter. This is James, the brother of Jesus. This is James, the brother of Jesus. And we know that James, the brother of Jesus, became the leader of the Jesus movement for about the next 30 years. Now, one of the great, great mysteries in the history of Christianity is how this James was so obscured and neglected from the consciousness of Christianity as a whole.
Meaning, are you referring to his writings later and how it
not just to his writings, but even to the existence of James, to his importance, to his significance? Basically, what you found was that even though James was the leader of the Jesus movement for about 30 years, and he was the brother of Jesus, meaning if anyone would have some insight, some knowledge. Right? I mean, he would be, and by the way, if there was going to be a succession after Jesus, you'd go to, the relatives. So he was chosen. He was made into the leader of the movement for 30 years, and he was a brother of Jesus. So you would think that in the entire Christian history, he'd be very, very significant. It's very clear that Peter is a big deal among Christians. But James was neglected. James was obscured. James was forgotten. And I think it's one of the great, great mysteries of Christian history that this very, very important leader of the movement was concealed and obscured and neglected from history. Let me give a few examples. A number of years ago, they found a bone box in Israel, an ossuary. Back in the 2,000 years ago when people were buried, so the body was put in a tomb on a shelf, and for about a year it was left there till all the skin dried up and all you had left was bones. And then, about a year after the person died, the bones are put into a box called an ossuary, and that ossuary was left in a tomb. And so they found the ossuary of James, and his name in Hebrew would have been Yaakov, or Jacob. And the box said on it, "This is Yaakov, this is James, the son of Joseph, the brother of Yeshua, the brother of Jesus." Now, when that was discovered, and actually they brought it here to Toronto for a while, but it was displayed in several parts of the world, it created a huge commotion, a huge stir. Why? Because most people, believe it or not, were shocked to even hear that Jesus had a brother. Even though the New Testament speaks about the fact that Jesus had brothers and sisters, it sort of became a forgotten thing in many ways. First of all, the Catholic Church didn't believe that Jesus had actual brothers and sisters. They claimed that these were actually cousins. And even though Protestants never made that switch, still, it's sort of like a passing phrase in the Gospels. They refer to Jesus' brothers and sisters, but it was insignificant. They weren't important. And so, the idea that there really were relatives of Jesus was not well known, to the point where, almost 2,000 years later, when they actually discover for the first time, don't forget, there's no archaeological evidence of Jesus at all. There's nothing. But here you have something that mentions him sort of indirectly, because this is the bone box, the ossuary of his brother, Yaakov, James, the son of Joseph, the brother of Jesus.
I
And
still,
so it was very controversial. People were shocked by this. And again, it simply illustrates the fact that James wasn't famous, even though he should have been.
right.
Another thing that's interesting, if you study the last 2,000 years of Christian art and Christian iconography, right? There has been plenty of Christian art and iconography. So you find Jesus and Mary and Peter. There's just about nothing of James. Isn't that strange? That in all those centuries, no one ever felt it was important to have a portrait, a picture, a painting, an icon, nothing. James is basically obscured. We know that James writes a book in the New Testament, right? The letter of James, the epistle of James. And yet, it's not really studied that much. It's not really a well-known book. I'm sure that over the past 2,000 years, not many sermons were given based upon the book of James. And it got so bad that Martin Luther wanted to basically remove it from the New Testament. Martin Luther called it the straw gospel. He felt that its message was really not consistent with the true message of Christianity, and for good reason. And so his desire was to basically just take it out altogether. So what's bizarre is that James is someone that provided just about the most critical, important, crucial link to Jesus himself, and yet for some reason in church history he is neglected, he is obscured, he is basically buried. And I think that we'll see as we go through the book of Acts, that's going to be a very, very strange thing to consider. The chapter ends here with the very, very horrible death experienced by Herod, by this Antipas I. So we're told in verse 20 that Herod became very angry with the people of Tyre and Sidon. Now, there's no clear reason why he becomes angry with them. These are two northern port cities. They're close to Lebanon. And for some reason, he just gets very angry with them. So they were concerned about this. It wasn't good for them at all to have the king upset with them. So they had someone named Blastus, who was the king's personal aide, and they wanted him to intercede on their behalf. And there was a day when Herod was going to be honored, and he came in his royal apparel, and he sat on his throne, and he gave a speech to them. And in verse 22 we're told that the people kept shouting, "The voice of a God and not of a man." And then we're told that immediately an angel of the Lord struck him because he did not give glory to God. Meaning that we're told, for example, earlier in the book of Acts, that Peter, I think it was in chapter 10, when people started to say to Peter that you're a god, he would say, "No, I'm just a man." Peter immediately denies it. But here, Herod is being given this honor and accord, that he's some kind of god and not a man, and he seems to accept this glorification. He accepts this honor and praise that he's a god. And so because he accepts the praise and honor and glory and he doesn't give it to God, we're told he was eaten by worms and died. Now, it's a strange story, I think, because, what exactly does it mean when the people are claiming here that he is a god and not a man. Um, it's interesting that Josephus himself verifies this story to a great extent. In the work of Josephus, Antiquities, we're told that Herod here, Herod Agrippa the First, dies in around the year 44 of the Common Era. And, if this is it's not really clear who's living in these cities. Are these Jewish people? Are they non-Jewish people? Is it a mixed group? But when they're claiming that he's a god, does it mean literally that they think he's a deity, a god that they would worship and pray to? Or are they just trying to butter him up? Is it just a way of praising him in an exaggerated way? Like for example, they would speak about, great guitar players as they're a god.
Right.
So, is it meant literally? Is it meant figuratively? It's not clear. But we saw previously that, people would use this term very loosely, like when they said that Peter was a god. So it's not clear exactly what these people had in their mind. But the story does seem to have some legs. It does seem to have some credibility, because we know from Josephus that he has some horrible stomach ailment. It's not clear exactly what it was, but he goes through agonizing pain in Josephus for about 5 days until he expires. And the chapter ends by telling us that the movement, the Jesus movement, continued to grow and multiply. But I think the significant thing about this chapter, and it ends in a strange way with Barnabas and Saul returning from Jerusalem. There's a whole dispute among the manuscripts. Is it returning to Jerusalem, from Jerusalem? I really don't know what to make of that. But what you really have in this chapter is, I believe, a continuation of the previous chapters, which speak about the spreading of this movement from a small Jewish group based in Jerusalem to Gentiles in the kingdom. You see here that the king, the leader, the ruler, not a Jewish ruler, he's Idumean, but he represents really the Roman rule. He clearly is threatened by this expansion of the Jesus movement, and I believe that's why he seeks to persecute them. And so the claim that his only interest is in getting on the good side of the Jews, to me, is just absurd, because the Roman leaders in general were not there to win popularity contests with the Jewish people. They were there to instill fear into the Jewish people in order to keep them in line. So I think that this chapter is just a good example of an extension of what happened in the Gospels in rewriting history with an agenda to again shift the blame for the persecution of the Jesus movement, including the death of Jesus and the persecution of his followers, away from the Romans and onto the people of Israel, the Jewish people as a whole. I think that's a very, very dominant theme, both in the Gospels and here you see again in the book of Acts.
Right.
So, my friend,
that is a wrap. Wow, that's a lot. You brought in a lot of neat things up, and it's kind of triggering some memories of what we went through with Matthew, And one thing, I don't know if it really pertains, but I was thinking of this morning. I was watching Fox News. And they have, all these politicians and stuff. They make these statements of matter of fact, but really they're not facts at all. They're just trying to convince people that it's already over, so you might as well come on board with us. And sometimes when I'm reading some of the New Testament stuff, it's kind of what it feels like. It kind of feels like they're like you've said before. I'm writing all this so that you will believe. And it's definitely a tricky. Pretty convincing way of writing to the unsuspecting, so.
Well, the problem is that, people have a tendency to take what they hear, and especially if it's in print, very seriously.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, people really are like that. They say, well, it must be true. I read it on the internet. And so
Yeah.
yet we
That's
have to
funny.
realize that, the church was brilliant
Mm-hmm.
in using the writings, the gospels, and the letters, the epistles and the letters, the pastoral letters and the gospels, as very, very powerful and effective propaganda. And as we go through church history, we know that it wasn't freedom of speech, and there wasn't free access to ideas. We know uh, with clarity that to the victor went the spoils, and
Mm-hmm.
anyone that had uh, a different take on things, anyone that had a point of view that was different, was squashed, and their point of view did not survive. Meaning that the writings of groups that were seen as heretical were basically tracked down, they were gathered up, and they were destroyed. That's why, for example, I've mentioned the Ebionites,
Mm-hmm.
which were a group of Jewish followers of Jesus who remained true to Judaism. They did not accept the idea of a virgin birth. They did not accept the deity of Jesus. They were very focused on the importance of keeping the commandments. They were seen by the second century already as heretics. They were seen as people who were not towing the party line of the church. And so we don't really have any writings of the Ebionites. They were basically destroyed. They were not preserved. And the only thing we know about the Ebionites are the writings about them by the church criticizing them.
Mm-hmm.
So, we at least know about them because they're written about as these horrible heretics who don't believe in the virgin birth and who don't believe in the Jesus as deity, etc. And they even observe the commandments of the Torah. Like, that's a bad thing.
Wow.
But that's what we have. So these writings, they are powerful because when people read them, there's an automatic assumption that this must be true. And so it is difficult when people have been reading these writings with a certain perspective, when you accept at face value everything that's said. And so it must have been true. It must have been true that all the Jews hated Jesus, and all the Jews were very happy to have him killed, and all the Jews were very happy to kill the leaders of the church. That may not be so simple. It may not be true. And I think that there is a tremendous amount of evidence to show that it's the opposite of what was probably really going on. And we have glimmers of evidence. The fact that the leader of the Jewish people, Gamliel, was not someone who was invested in persecuting the church and killing them. And the fact that we see people like Paul had the freedom to move around the Jewish community and share their views without being immediately killed. And we know the behavior of the Romans. See, that's the thing that, they can't hide from. We know the brutality of the Romans. And we know that, that it becomes very clear that the story of Jesus is written with an agenda. And the agenda was very clearly to shift the blame and focus away from those truly responsible for his death and execution onto a very convenient scapegoat, which were the Jewish leaders. And I think we just see more of the same here in the book of Acts. So we'll have a chance to explore more of this, and especially to really think more about James and his role in the history of Christianity. We'll see it's quite important, especially as we get to chapter 15 in a few weeks.
Perfect. Well, tell you what, as usual, it's always fun going through this New Testament stride with you. Look forward to next week. And ladies and gentlemen, definitely same time, same place next week. If we ever have to shift it around for you to a different time like before, we'll try to let you know early enough so you can get to it at the right time. So, Rabbi, again, thank you so very much. Everybody, thank you for tuning in. JewsForJudaism.ca. Check them out, subscribe to the website, find them on YouTube, get all of his good videos. We've got them all over the place. See you, everybody. Shalom, shalom.
חשוב מכל חשוב, הכרחי להיות ביחד, איפוק העוצמה, ויתור זו הגדולה, השאיפה